Welcome to What We Think, brought to you by Marts&Lundy. Marts&Lundy is a strategic consulting firm committed to advancing the field of philanthropy. We help mission-driven organizations build the capacity they need to achieve their highest potential. In this podcast series, our experienced consultants and special guests will share insights on current opportunities, trends, and challenges in philanthropy.
So welcome everybody back to Marts&Lundy podcast. I am your host for today, Veronica Vereen, a consultant here with Marts&Lundy, and I'm very excited to welcome Nathan Chappell to the conversation. Today, we are going to be discussing how AI can increase the equity of your prospecting. Welcome, Nathan.
Well, thank you, Veronica. It's always great to connect with you and with Marts&Lundy, and honored to be here today.
So Nathan, tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, well, I never thought I would be here kind of as this, AI quote unquote expert or subject matter expert. 20 years ago, I was actually started two companies, both with a technical side to them, but ended up in the nonprofit sector. I was a board member, ended up in the nonprofit sector kind of on accident, fell in love with it, never thought it was a career. And while I was going through grad school, I just, actually fell in love with the idea that you could make money and also do good, and which in business school really was never taught as like an option. So one of those fortunate people that fell into this at the right time before I had golden handcuffs, and it's an amazing trajectory. So spent a number of years as a consultant in higher education, and then quite a bit in healthcare. It was essentially in healthcare fundraising that I probably more than anything became disenchanted with the lack of innovation that nonprofits had at their fingertips to identify people that were most deeply connected or feeling positive about the organization. And so one day, I think I got so fed up with this idea of just trying to predict people on just a few data points and, in a static way, as a donor or a prospect, decided to learn everything I could about machine learning, and spent about a year and a half surrounding myself with really smart people, several PhDs, and I was just that annoying, felt like a 6-year-old that would like constantly ask everyone I could questions about why this and why that and why not this and why not that. And that goes back to 2017. So it's been a number of years now that moved on from that annoying 6-year-old kind of personality to being able to work with some of the top nonprofits in the country to deploy some really sophisticated, machine learning, deep learning models. And it's still a continual learning, journey. Every day is something new and different and things that we can explore. And there's going to be a lot more of that into the future. So excited to be here, with you to share some of those experiences.
Well, thank you. Well, I don't want to waste any time. I definitely want to jump in because this is a topic that makes me really excited. Coming from the development space, I have to say that AI is one of those areas that either you feel like you know a little bit or you feel like you never know anything. So can you give us a little background about the history of AI and how it was adopted?
Yeah, it's so interesting how you frame that, because I find myself in conversations all the time where sometimes I'll just be talking about things that I think everyone really fully understands and realize they're like I lost them like 10 minutes before. And then other times people are really really knowledgeable about what's going on. So it's a hard topic because there's such a vast array of people's expertise in that. So the way we usually just describe AI in general, AI is essentially kind of just extremely general term. It's kind of not a made up term, but it really stands for this idea that computers would replicate things that humans would have done previously. And AI in itself, and there's an interesting philanthropy history with AI, but the term was coined in 1955 by a guy named John McCarthy, But his project, which was a summer project to explore this ability for humans to think like, or for computers to think like humans, was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. And a lot of people don't know that. So it's just kind of an interesting kind of thing. So, if you really like AI or you blame AI, it goes back to some philanthropy that really got the ball rolling. But of course, AI that we use today is mainly known as machine learning and deep learning and natural language processing, which are all separate technologies, kind of subsets of different artificial intelligent technologies that are used for different purposes. For the most part, when people talk about AI or think about AI today, it's either they're using the map on their phone or in their car, or they're speaking to Siri or Alexa, and my Alexa will probably turn on in a second because it's always listening. Those are the forms of AI that are used in everyday life that people are just very much more comfortable with now than they were even a couple of years ago, because you're starting to see some benefit. Some of the things that you can just ask a question versus typing in a question and then looking, scrolling through answers, just get a verbal answer. It's become much more part of our everyday life.
Yeah, I agree. I think that just from a personal experience, I feel like AI, I'm buying things on Amazon, or I hear Instagram influencers talking about their algorithm and how it's changing. So I think that the general public has a very small understanding of it. But I'm always curious from the philanthropy standpoint in relation to business. How are we adopting AI? I mean, are we ahead of the game? Are we behind?
Well, I don't know many areas in technology where nonprofits have been ahead of the game. There's usually that fun dinner conversation of how many years behind are we, and for a variety of different reasons. Mainly when you're measured by this cost per dollar raised, and you're trying to make sure that as every possible cent goes into supporting your mission, the trade-off is like, let's not invest in risky things. But AI has definitely become less risky in the last few years. So, really when it comes down to it, the for-profit sector, you mentioned Amazon, Microsoft, Google are, have been using really heavy doses of AI, machine learning, deep learning for a number of years. I would say the last 10 years have been probably, the largest amount of growth in this space. And we're starting to see the fruit of that, because AI is, and if you think about this term machine learning, we'll just use that instead. The operative word of machine learning is learning. That Amazon, every time you buy something, it actually is learning from your buying behaviors. Like, how many reviews do you read? How far do you scroll down? Do you tend to purchase right away, or do you tend to purchase after going back and forth and comparing 3 different products? They've learned so much that they've actually patented the ability to start shipping products to you before you actually hit the purchase button. So they will put stuff in box, put it on the conveyor belt, pull it from inventory based on your viewing habits, because it's learned from you so many times over the past number of years that the confidence is that much higher. I'd say with that, because people are starting to see the benefits of AI and it's become less risky, the people in the nonprofit sector are realizing, there's a couple combining factors. One is less people are giving less. So this kind of idea of the generosity crisis, or Giving USA showing, for 40 years, there's an ongoing decline in the percentage of households that give. The nonprofits can't do the same thing and expect a different result. And so the idea, and even when I was at City of Hope, was, working smarter, not harder, was kind of like our mantra. It wasn't just about hiring more gift officers. It wasn't just about working more hours. It's about working smarter. And that's no longer a luxury. Like, that is the era that we live in nonprofits. So I think that's forcing, the need to look at different solutions. And, of course, looking at the private sector and saying, wow, private sector has gained tremendous efficiencies using machine learning and deep learning and natural language processing in different areas. Like, how do we apply that to nonprofit? And so we're seeing lots and lots of examples now, which lots, I guess, and I'll use air quotes since we're on audio, comparatively to the private sector, I think nonprofits, around 25% of nonprofits are using or exploring AI versus around 97% of for-profit organizations. So there are many, many more examples today than there were 5 years ago in the nonprofit sector, from delivering how you're delivering your mission to the end result, whether it's, through ordering or through identifying vulnerable populations or whatever it might be. 5 years ago, there were only a handful. So there's many more examples. I think where we're at today, to go back specifically to your question, there's this kind of idea of crossing the chasm, which is the adoption of technology, the technology adoption life cycle, which essentially means that, to become commonplace for like more than 51% of nonprofits using AI, you have to cross this chasm. And what it takes to cross that chasm, before it's essentially early adopters, you need credible references. And the most important part is that you have nonprofits out there that are household names, that have brand recognition, that are kind of the good housekeeping seal of approval that others will follow. Once they're using quote unquote AI in any form, others will start to follow. And we're just seeing that, honestly, this last year, like the last 2 years, where there's been some of the, I would consider, best in class nonprofits that have a bit more money to put to risk, to innovate and try new things. They've done it. They're starting to see really good results. And then essentially the kind of tribal nature of nonprofits is then others will follow. And this is just part of the technology life cycle. I think we're still several years away from when it's so common that everyone is doing it, but I 100% believe in my heart of hearts that day will come. I'd say the next 5 years will be formative in the nonprofit sector, that there'll be mass adoption of different forms of quote unquote AI in the near future.
That's really exciting. I mean, I think back to my time as a frontline fundraiser, and there were different aspects of prospecting that we were able to use. One that I'm thinking about in particular was a communication device that we were able to just engage with different constituents. It was going to tell us, pull people from our prospect list, be able to say, this one really is one that you need to follow up with. But I think about our partnership with DonorSearch and you, and the fact that this is what we are going into, this next phase of AI is leaps and bounds of what I experienced as a frontline fundraiser. The development space is not even prepared for what is coming around the corner. And I think that that's what's really exciting about what prospecting can be and what it will be in the future when we use AI correctly. But I think that there's also a concern about how do we make sure that this process remains equitable, that it is without bias. So can you speak a little bit about how we can continue to make sure that those guardrails are up as we move forward in adopting AI in our development workshops? Yeah.
So, I mean, probably, if not one of the most important, conversations around the use of AI in the nonprofit world, and as we're talking about something that's sacred like philanthropy and that people tend to hold very, close. I mean, I'll go back just to your kind of earlier point of, different nonprofits are using different forms and experimenting with different forms of AI, and this is a new frontier. Like, this is an area that there are no essentially, quote unquote, best practices in the nonprofit sector of what makes good or bad AI. There's a lot of Wild West, kind of blazing new frontiers. And with that comes a lot of, probably some really strong innovations, but also some risk that, done incorrectly, it can have immeasurable negative consequences for the nonprofit sector. And one of those biggest areas will be in this area of both ethics and equality in data. So as nonprofits are really moving toward kind of this new frontier without a lot of guardrails, the potential for things to go awry is there. And that's where, I think the industry itself has a unique advantage in that, even though nonprofits tend, from traditional terms, compete against each other for revenue, for donors, they're also extremely collaborative. And in this space where there's not a lot of best practices, there's this opportunity. And I see a lot of open dialogue around like, what are you doing and what are you trying and what's worked and what's not worked? Because ultimately, I think one of the greatest risks of any technology is that in our space is that you could trade the relationship for a transaction. And so, so I'll start there by just, before we get into the ethics and equality side even more, is that this idea first and foremost is that we're a relationship business, and that relationship should always be front and center, way beyond revenue. Revenue is essentially the outcome of how well you form that relationship and whether it was authentic or not. And if it's bi-directional, like you know me and I know you, not just you're a wallet that I'm trying to extract money from. So that's a big shift, and there's a lot of risk for nonprofits that unwilling or unknowing, I guess, may tend to use technology that is just going to really almost make giving more transactional than it's ever been. So a lot of awareness needs to happen there. I'm a pessimist and an optimist both on this idea of ethics and equality with using artificial intelligence, and mainly because when I look back at the way we used to do things, like 5 years ago, before we had the ability to use machine learning, deep learning, we were adding tremendous amount of bias in our models, in any kind of predictive models, because we were limited so much in the type of data that we were using. So the average logistic regression model that's used just statistically uses 18 to 24 data points. And there's reasons for it, because essentially those models, that's when they perform best, when they're very limited in scope. But if you try to describe me in 18 to 24 data points, you're only going to not even scratching the surface would not even be at all like 1% of who I am and the things that I'm really passionate about or enjoy or connected with, and the way I operate as a human. So with that said, when we talk about the advent of deep learning and in the nonprofit space, to really understand someone through, say, 1,000 data points, we're much better off. There's much less bias in that idea of I can now look to describe someone in 1,000 data points versus 18. With all that said, there's a lot of risk that comes with that, because this when you're using 1,000 data points, it gets beyond what a human can comprehend of like, this data is true or not true, or it's essentially duplicative or underrepresented. And so there's a couple of things that I think, and I don't claim to be an expert. I claim to be a student on this in the space. This is something that I think I will continue to always learn, and I've actually take courses on ethics and equality in data, because it's an area that I believe knowledge, or not knowledge, well, knowledge, but education and willingness to understand is the most important part of the journey. Like, we have to be willing to want to explore in what's going on. So when we think about, and I actually just finished a 6-hour course on this topic a couple of months ago, and it was so enlightening, because I realized, maybe I should have realized a long time ago, that first and foremost, that the data that most nonprofits are using to start with is inherently biased, because the nonprofit sector for many years, probably since the advent of wealth screening, which probably goes back 20 or 30 years, has been primarily focused on how rich is someone. And, unfortunately with that, there's tremendous bias on wealth and the class that represents. So for many nonprofits, if you think about traditionally healthcare organizations that screen, 1 million patients a year, and they tend to only add people in their database that show up to be wealthy, well, those data sets are primarily biased toward rich white men, unfortunately. And so even if I'm now going to use deep learning on a organization's file that for 40 years has prioritized as rich white men, there's inherent bias in the data that I'm using to start with. Not that we can change that overnight, but that awareness is absolutely critical, is to say, okay, it's directly to your question there. I don't believe there is such thing as having a non-biased model to date, but there's the ability to have much less biased models. And so one is being aware of the data set and essentially deprioritizing things that are either implicit or inherent bias. So, things like race and even age comes in quite often to models, and how do you deal with those? There is a difference between someone that's older that has more discretionary income that might make a major gift because they're not putting their kids through college, but those are really important questions. Of course, implicit bias like gender and race have no place in models. They should be removed immediately. So there's both a human element from a data science perspective, we as humans have to be aware, and we have to be educated, and we have to be open and honest with each other, and we have to identify data points that are introducing implicit bias. But we also, because we're using so much data, that machine learning deep algorithms even create their own features. They create their own variables that are very complex. It could be someone's age divided by the square footage of their home divided by the number of kids in their home is now a new feature, a variable that deep learning will come up with. It's when you've got 2,000 variables in a single, calculating one person's connection, it's pretty hard to do when you're talking about 1 million people. So there are a lot of advances in a lot more sensitivity now than there ever has been of using deep learning to discover bias. And so it has to be both on the human side of people consciously not producing a model and deploying a model without having humans look at and interrogate and question, but also using machines to also very dedicated with the lens of looking for redundancy and looking for bias, both inherent and implicit bias. So we actually use algorithms that we have a two-step process, the human part and then the computer part, and the computer will flag anything that it thinks is potentially overfitting or oversubscribed to even what might be kind of a nascent data point. So I guess with all that said, still a new frontier, but one that deserves a lot of attention. And I guess for me, the reason why is nonprofits are unique in the sense that philanthropy is based almost entirely on trust that you say you are who you are, that you're going to take my hard-earned dollars and put it to the best possible use. So trust essentially is the currency of the nonprofit sector. And with that said, I think the nonprofit sector deserves more attention and more deliberate conversation around this topic of ethics and equality around data than really any other sector. Because, if Twitter creates an extremely biased algorithm, which they have, ageist, racist, ableist algorithm, their stock price goes down, and they can choose to mitigate that however they want to do, some crisis communication strategies. But if a very well-known nonprofit does that, there's this inherent distrust of like, well, what other nonprofits are doing the same? It affects everyone. I think much more than just anyone's particular stock price. So I think the stakes are higher, I guess, is really probably the way to sum that up.
And I think what I take away from what you just shared is that nonprofits have to proceed with caution, but they always have to be constant learners and be open to what is around the corner in regards to AI. And I think that development space hasn't always been looked at AI or looked at new technologies as something that they can really embrace all the time, because a lot of times in the development world, efficiency translates in our mind to transactional and not relationship. When relationship and efficiency are the same thing.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. And this is where organizations struggle with this idea that, at the end of the day, I think wrongly, this is a different soapbox, that nonprofit leaders are measured by how much money you bring in, not by how many donors you retain or, grow by and retain, and at the end of the day, your incentives aren't aligned with donors' incentives. So, the reality is, I think until nonprofits really embrace this idea that, relationship, the measure of success is based on the depth of relationship, not based on the depth of dollars a person gives you in a 12-month period, so yeah.
That's 3 snaps for that comment. I agree.
Yeah, so that trade-off of like efficiency is appealing to a lot of nonprofits, because it's like, oh, well, then I could just squeeze more juice out of the lemon. I could get more revenue in this year versus let's deploy technology that reinforces this kind of bi-directional relationship. Again, it's like, it's all about, I said this at a conference recently, is that the value of your database is measured in the depth of connection and has nothing to do with the wealth. And when people hear that, they often like resonate with it. They're like, oh yeah, that's true. Because like, no matter how much worth, and I've had prospect development people on my teams in the past say, our database is worth 3.x billion dollars because if you added up all the wealth in my database, well, it's actually worth nothing if those people don't know you in an intimate way, right? I mean, if they're just names of rich people. So I think this idea of using AI in a very holistic, in a relationship-centric way, and the ethics and equality piece go hand in hand with that, because you can't continually get to know people if you don't actually know them, and because it will never feel authentic if you're treating people with extreme bias because of whatever their wealth or whatever it might be. But definitely, to your point, it's an area that deserves a lot more conversation, a lot more attention, a lot more study, real research, and there's some of that going on right now, which is great. Just in the last few years.
Well, I am like at the edge of my seat, Nathan. This is such an exciting topic. I can't wait to just be able to investigate this more with some of the clients that we have the opportunity to work with on.
Yeah, I think that the exciting part of marrying data science with really strong thought leadership like Marts&Lundy, and really to give you a plug here, is because as a data scientist, or as a data provider and score provider, we can have the most amazing data and insights all day long, and they can be less biased and they could be more relationship centric. But if that's not translated to the people that are actually using it, and it really comes down to kind of a change management perspective, because this approach in this space, and this is not just ours, but this is just where things are going to go in the nonprofit sector. Everyone will be using AI. If it's not fully understood by the end user, you're essentially trusting a black box to tell you what to do, and that's just not good for anyone. It's not good for the organization. It's not good for the donors. But having an organization that really understands the need to kind of interrogate the data and to train people on this is what is in this. I don't believe in the black box in the nonprofit sector. I don't think there should be any proprietary algorithms, because essentially that black box is you're putting your trust in someone else's definition of connection versus your organization. And so at the end of the day, an organization like Marts&Lundy, that's taking all this rich data, can interrogate it, can translate it back to the client, can talk to the client about what does this feel like? What does it work? Does this work? Does it not work? Because we've moved past this idea that people are finite, like that you could score somebody every 3 years, and then you're either a prospect or you're a donor, or you're a good donor or a bad donor. People are people that every day take action that brings them closer or further away to your organization. And we know by Amazon is that they don't treat you the same today that they treated you 5 years ago, because they'd still be recommending things that you've moved way past, whatever those hobbies were that, or things that you used to purchase. So that organizations need to really move to this idea that people have varying degrees and opportunities to get close to an organization, that those opportunities can grow or diminish over time. But it really comes down to the awareness of, like, what is the data saying and why is it saying what it's saying? And then how do you deploy that in a way that's fair and ethical and with much less bias, or as least amount of bias as possible?
That's a great point. As we wrap things up today, I think a few of the takeaways that we have is that the the integration of AI, whether it's machine learning or deep learning, has really transitioned over the last couple of years. And the nonprofit world really needs to be ready to embrace it, because there is opportunity to connect more and more real connection with our constituents and have those relationships that are going to blossom from the initial experience all the way until a major gift. So it's really exciting to have that in our forefront to look forward to. Also, I mean, just making sure that we are constantly being learners, as Nathan shared earlier, that we are making sure that our process is equitable for all of those prospects that are part of our pool. We want to make sure that we're continuing to test and understand that we are getting to the true root of the person, and not just a few data points or features that we see or have traditionally seen in our constituents. And then also that, great data is important to have, but what you do with it next is how Marts&Lundy can really be a partner with this process, making sure that you're integrating it not only from your prospect management pool, but also from the entire team, that there's a team effort to make sure that that change is implemented throughout the organization moving forward. With that all said, I want to take a moment and personally just thank Nathan for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much, Veronica. It's always a pleasure being able to chat with you, and truly the honor is all mine for being able to be here and for our ability to partner with Marts&Lundy to really be able to approach nonprofit organizations with not only the best data, but the best thought leadership that goes along with that data.
It has been a pleasure to have an opportunity to pick your brain as a data scientist, as an AI guru, to really understand where AI is today and where we're going in the future. But I just want to say thank you so much for the time, and tune in next time.
We thank you for listening and invite you to visit our What We Think page at martsandlundy.com. Here you will find blogs, webinars, and special reports with more of our insights.